The Great Fire of London, 1666. Before the fire, London in the year 1666 was a city of wood and tar, a bustling capital that had not yet embraced the sturdiness of stone and brick. Narrow, winding streets were crammed with timber houses leaning into each other, their upper floors so close they nearly touched. The smell of fishmongers, tanners, and open sewers filled the air. This was a city of trade and ambition, but also a tinderbox waiting for a single spark. Few could imagine how quickly the heart of the greatest city in England would be consumed by fire. The summer had been unusually hot and dry. For weeks, not a single drop of rain had fallen. Wells had sunk low, and the wooden houses, beams, and thatched roofs were dry as bone. London's citizens, unaware of the danger lurking in every ember, carried on with their trade. Sailors came and went from the Thames, merchants crowded Cheapside, and apprentices ran through alleys with messages. Yet beneath this busyness, nature had laid the perfect conditions for catastrophe. It began in the early hours of Sunday, September 2nd. On Pudding Lane, in the bakery of Thomas Fariner, a small spark caught hold of kindling. Whether from a neglected oven or an accidental ember, no one truly knows. Fariner's family awoke to smoke, rushing to escape as the flames licked at the wooden beams. But before they could act, the fire had spread to nearby buildings. Within moments, Pudding Lane was ablaze and the inferno had been born. At first, Londoners thought it was just another house fire, nothing unusual in a city where flames were part of daily life. But as the bells of St. Magnus the Martyr began to toll, the reality set in. The wind picked up, carrying sparks across rooftops. Watchmen shouted warnings, and panicked families began grabbing whatever belongings they could carry. Few realized this was not just a fire, it was the beginning of the destruction of London itself. A strong easterly wind blew relentlessly through the city, turning the fire into a ravenous beast. It leapt from house to house, street to street, consuming everything in its path. The close-packed buildings fed the inferno like dry straw. Fire hooks and buckets were useless against the gale. In mere hours, entire streets disappeared under roaring towers of flame. Londoners could only watch in horror as their world turned to ash. As the morning of September 2nd broke, the fire was no longer confined to Pudding Lane. It had become a living monster that devoured street after street, and its hunger seemed endless. The people of London, ordinary merchants, tradesmen, women and children, began to flee in a panic unlike anything they had ever known. Shouts of fear filled the air, mingled with the deafening roar of flames and the constant crack of timber collapsing into cinders. Families loaded carts with what little they could save: bedding, clothing, silverware, and religious books, only to abandon them when the fire overtook them faster than their horses could pull. Mothers clutched infants to their chests, fathers carried elderly relatives on their backs, and apprentices stumbled with household goods that meant little against the raging fire. The streets clogged with refugees, all pushing toward the River Thames, hoping to escape by boat. Yet even there, the flames licked at the wharves, setting warehouses and barrels of oil alight. The Thames itself glowed with reflections of fire, and the smoke choked even the strongest lungs. London was no longer a city of order and trade. It had become a vision of hell on earth. By midday, word had reached Whitehall Palace. King Charles II and his advisors convened in urgent discussion. The Lord Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, had been called upon to take swift action, but his response was tragically inadequate. When advised to pull down houses to create fire breaks, Bloodworth hesitated, famously declaring, "A woman might piss it out." His dismissal proved fatal. Every hour of hesitation allowed the fire to spread unchecked until all control was lost. Meanwhile, Charles II, though often remembered for his indulgent court and flamboyant ways, acted decisively in this crisis. He ordered fire breaks to be made by demolishing rows of houses, and he dispatched his brother, the Duke of York, to take command of firefighting efforts. But by then, the blaze had already gained the upper hand. London's leadership faltered when unity and urgency were needed most, and the indecision of its officials became part of the tragedy that unfolded. London Bridge became a river of humanity, Men, women and children crowded its narrow span, trying to flee the inferno that pressed ever closer. The ancient bridge groaned under the weight of carts, livestock, and endless lines of people. Chickens squawked, dogs barked, and horses neighed in panic as owners beat them forward, desperate to escape. From the bridge, the sight was horrifying. To the north, the city was swallowed in fire, entire parishes glowing like a sea of molten gold. To the south, refugees poured into the fields of Suffolk, their faces blackened with soot, their eyes wide with disbelief. Many clutched religious relics and crucifixes, praying aloud as if Judgment Day itself had arrived. Children cried for lost parents, and families were separated in the chaos. Some who made it across looked back in stunned silence, realizing that the London they had known was being reduced to embers before their very eyes. At the heart of London stood St. Paul's Cathedral, the great medieval masterpiece that had watched over the city for centuries. Many Londoners believed the cathedral was invincible, its stone walls thought to be a safeguard against fire. Booksellers even moved their stock into the cathedral's crypt, believing it would be safe. But the flames showed no reverence. On the night of September 4th, fire reached the great cathedral, driven by wind and fueled by stores of timber, pitch and books piled within. Witnesses described an apocalyptic vision. The roof, made of ancient timber, erupted in flames, glowing like a giant torch. Sheets of molten lead poured from the roof and ran down the streets in fiery rivers. The mighty walls, weakened by the inferno, collapsed in thunderous crashes, sending sparks and debris across the city. Londoners watched in horror as their spiritual heart, a symbol of endurance and faith, was consumed. In that moment, many felt that London itself was dying. For 4 relentless days, the Great Fire of London raged like an unstoppable storm. By Tuesday, September 4th, it had consumed nearly 2/3 of the city. Over 13,000 houses, 87 churches, countless shops, warehouses and civic buildings had vanished in smoke and ash. The once orderly capital was now a charred wasteland, filled with wandering refugees who no longer knew where home was. And yet, in the midst of destruction, the resilience of Londoners began to show. Makeshift camps rose in fields outside the city walls, where the homeless gathered, cooking over open fires and sharing what little food they had salvaged. Priests led prayers, and soldiers maintained order to prevent looting. The fire that had nearly destroyed London also revealed the spirit of its people. Broken, frightened, but unyielding. They had lost their city, but not their hope. As the fire spread into every corner of the city, desperation gave way to madness. Families, overwhelmed by fear and loss, attempted impossible acts to save their belongings. Men tied ropes around heavy trunks and dragged them through the cobbled streets, only to abandon them when the flames closed in. Women buried valuables beneath gardens and courtyards, praying the fire would pass before the ground scorched. Some merchants even hurled barrels of wine into the Thames, believing the river might preserve their fortune. Others, however, turned their attention to looting. In the smoke-filled alleys, thieves darted into abandoned homes, snatching whatever valuables they could before the fire swallowed them whole. The line between survival and sin blurred, and London, usually a city bound by order and trade, descended into chaos. Soldiers were dispatched to restore calm, but even they could do little in the face of a disaster that consumed everything in sight. The Thames River, usually London's lifeline of trade and commerce, became a highway of escape. Boats, barges and ferries swarmed the waters, overflowing with terrified citizens and hastily loaded belongings. Sailors rowed furiously, while others tied barges together to ferry entire families across to safety. But the river, too, became a stage of chaos. Sparks carried by the wind ignited warehouses along the banks, setting barrels of oil and pitch ablaze. Fire leapt from dock to dock, sending columns of smoke towering into the heavens. The air reeked of burning tar, salt fish, and scorched flesh. From the water, refugees looked back at their city, its skyline blackened and distorted by flame. Some wept openly, others simply sat in silent disbelief, clutching children who stared wide-eyed at the glowing ruin. London, once the jewel of England, now looked more like the mouth of an inferno. As the fire advanced eastward, a new terror gripped the citizens, the safety of the Tower of London. Within its thick walls lay not only the crown jewels, but also vast stores of gunpowder. Should the flames reach the tower, the resulting explosion would obliterate half the city and slaughter thousands. King Charles II, realizing the peril, dispatched troops to surround the fortress and demolish nearby houses. Soldiers worked desperately, hacking down timber walls with axes, even as sparks fell around them. The fate of London itself seemed to hang in the balance. Mercifully, the flames slowed as they neared the tower, checked by fire breaks and the shifting winds. London was spared the unimaginable horror of its own fortress erupting in flames, but the fear had shaken the population to its core. For many, it was a sign of divine intervention that even in judgment God had spared England's crown. King Charles II was not content to remain within his palace while London burned. Dressed simply, without the trappings of royal ceremony, he rode into the city, accompanied by his brother, the Duke of York. Witnesses recorded how the king himself ordered men to pull down houses, using gunpowder to blast gaps in the streets to stop the fire's march. This was no ordinary monarch. He was seen laboring alongside his people, his hands blackened by soot, his voice commanding order in the chaos. The sight restored courage to many, and men rallied to the king's side. In that desperate moment, the line between ruler and subject blurred, united by a common struggle to save their city. For once, Londoners saw not the merry monarch of courtly scandal, but a king who fought with them in the flames. By the fourth day, September 5th, the fire's fury began to weaken. The strong easterly winds that had fanned the flames finally dropped, giving firefighters their first real chance at control. Exhausted men and women worked shoulder to shoulder, passing buckets of water, tearing down structures and smothering embers. The great roar of the fire, which had dominated the city like a beast's growl, began to fade into crackling ruins and drifting smoke. London was battered, scarred, and unrecognizable, but at last the nightmare was ending. For many, this shift in the winds felt like the hand of Providence itself, a divine signal that judgment had been satisfied. Survivors emerged from the fields where they had camped, looking back at the smoldering city with hollow eyes. The fire had run its course, but the wounds it left behind would linger for generations. When the flames finally died, the scale of destruction stunned the world. Over 4/5 of London had been reduced to ashes. More than 13,000 houses lay in ruins, along with 87 parish churches, 44 company halls, and countless shops, warehouses, and businesses. St. Paul's Cathedral was gone, along with the Guildhall and nearly every civic building of importance. Astonishingly, the official death toll was recorded as remarkably low, perhaps only a handful of people. Yet historians suspect that the true number was far higher. For the poor and unrecorded may have vanished in the flames without a trace. For those who survived, the loss was incalculable. Entire families were rendered homeless. Merchants lost lifetimes of goods. London's economy, its politics, and its very identity had been transformed in 4 days of fire. In the aftermath, Londoners sought shelter wherever they could. Fields around Islington, Moorfields, and Southwark became vast refugee camps. Families built makeshift huts from timber scraps and canvas, while others slept under the open sky. Chickens pecked at the ash-stained ground, and livestock wandered untended. It was a vision of medieval displacement in the heart of a modern capital. Yet within the suffering, there were glimpses of resilience. Neighbors shared bread and ale, priests led prayers of thanksgiving for survival, and merchants discussed how they might begin again. London's spirit, though battered, had not been extinguished. Amid the smoke and sorrow, the first seeds of rebuilding were already being planted. As the ashes cooled, Londoners demanded to know, how had this disaster begun? Fingers quickly pointed toward foreigners, Catholics, and even conspirators. England was at war with France and the Netherlands, and rumors spread that enemies had set the fire deliberately. Innocent strangers were beaten in the streets, accused of arson with no proof. Thomas Fariner, the baker of Pudding Lane, became the focus of suspicion, but he denied responsibility, claiming his ovens had been safely extinguished. In truth, the cause may never be fully known. Perhaps it was a simple accident, a spark in a bakery on a dry night. Yet in a city already tense with fear, suspicion turned grief into anger, and xenophobia left scars as deep as the fire itself. To restore order and hope, King Charles II issued proclamations assuring Londoners that their city would rise again. He promised food, shelter, and assistance to the homeless, and he guaranteed that trade would resume on the Thames. More importantly, he declared that London would not simply be rebuilt, but rebuilt stronger, safer, and more magnificent. His words carried more than royal command. They carried the promise of renewal. Londoners, still trembling from loss, clung to this vision. Out of destruction, their monarch envisioned a capital worthy of England's growing power in the world. The Great Fire, though devastating, was already being framed as an opportunity for rebirth. Amid the ashes stepped one of history's great architects, Sir Christopher Wren. A brilliant mathematician and visionary, Wren saw in the devastation not an end, but a canvas. He proposed an entirely new London, designed with wide boulevards, grand squares, and buildings of stone that could withstand future fires. His most ambitious plan included a new St. Paul's Cathedral, a masterpiece to rival the greatest churches of Europe. While many of his grand designs were too ambitious to be realized, his vision reshaped the city nonetheless. It was Wren's genius, supported by royal will, that transformed London from a medieval warren of timber alleys into the beginnings of a modern capital. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel so that when we drop a new video, it will alert you. Thank you for watching.